Scary camping, there's something about the woods that unsettles me. Maybe it's the feeling of isolation, the dense trees blocking out all but the faintest rays of moonlight. Maybe it's the eerie silence, broken only by the occasional rustle of leaves or the distant cry of an animal. Whatever it is, I never quite shook the feeling, even when my friends convinced me to join them on a weekend camping trip. I told myself it would be fun, an adventure, but in the back of my mind, I knew something about the trip would go wrong. I just didn't know how wrong. It started off harmless enough. There were 5 of us, me, Jake, Sarah, Tom, and Emily. We'd all been friends since college, and this was supposed to be our last big hurrah before life got in the way. Jake had planned the trip, assuring us he knew of a perfect spot, deep in the woods, miles away from civilization. It would be quiet, peaceful, he said, perfect for getting away from the stresses of work, relationships, and the constant buzz of city life. We packed our gear into 2 cars and left early Friday morning. The drive was long, winding through back roads and small towns that seemed frozen in time. As we got closer to the forest, the towns became fewer, and eventually we didn't see any at all. Just miles of trees on either side of the road. The campsite was a couple of miles into the woods, Jake said. He led us down a narrow, unmarked trail, our cars left behind in a gravel clearing that served as a makeshift parking lot. As we hiked, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. I kept glancing over my shoulder, expecting to see someone or something following us. But there was nothing, just trees and shadows. The campsite was exactly as Jake had promised. A small clearing, surrounded by towering pines, with a fire pit in the center and enough space for our tents. We set up camp, laughing and joking as we worked. For a while, I forgot about my unease. The afternoon passed quickly, and soon we were sitting around a crackling fire, the sun dipping below the horizon, casting long shadows across the clearing as night fell. The forest around us came alive with sounds, the chirping of crickets, the rustling of leaves in the wind, the occasional hoot of an owl. It was peaceful in a way, but still that feeling of being watched lingered. I told myself it was just my imagination, that I was being paranoid, that we stayed up late, talking and laughing, telling ghost stories to spook each other. Tom, ever the skeptic, rolled his eyes at every tale of hauntings and strange creatures. "It's just the woods," he said, dismissing our fears. "There's nothing out here but animals and trees." But as the fire died down and the night grew darker, even Tom grew quiet. We all fell into an uneasy silence, staring into the dying embers of the fire. It was Emily who broke the silence. "Did you guys hear that?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. We all froze, listening. At first, I didn't hear anything, but then, there it was, a faint rustling in the trees, far off, but getting closer. Could have been the wind, I told myself, but the wind didn't sound like that. Jake stood up, squinting into the darkness. "Probably just a deer," he said, but his voice lacked the usual confidence. The rustling grew louder, closer. It was slow, deliberate, as if whatever was making the sound was circling us, just beyond the reach of the firelight. "Maybe we should go check it out," Tom said, standing up as well. "Are you crazy?" Sarah hissed. "We don't know what's out there." "It's probably nothing," Tom said, but he didn't sound convinced. Jake grabbed a flashlight from his backpack and turned it on, the beam cutting through the darkness. He walked to the edge of the clearing, shining the light into the trees. We all held our breath, waiting. "There's nothing out here," Jake said after a moment, turning back to us. "It's probably just some animal passing through." But then the rustling stopped. The silence that followed was unnerving, like the forest itself was holding its breath. And then, out of nowhere, came a low, guttural growl. It wasn't like anything I'd ever heard before, not the growl of any animal I could recognize. It was deep, almost human, and it sent a chill down my spine. Jake whipped the flashlight back toward the trees, but there was nothing there, just shadows. "We need to get out of here," Emily said, her voice trembling. "No," Jake said, shaking his head. "We're fine. It's just the woods messing with us. If we leave now, we'll just get lost in the dark." But I wasn't so sure. That growl, it wasn't natural. There was something out there. Something watching us. We all huddled closer to the fire, trying to shake off the growing sense of dread. The rustling had stopped, but now there was something else. An almost imperceptible whispering, like voices carried on the wind. I glanced at the others, but no one seemed to hear it. "We should take turns keeping watch," Jake said finally, "just to be safe." We agreed, though none of us were thrilled at the idea of being alone in the dark. Jake took the first watch, sitting by the fire with the flashlight in his lap while the rest of us retreated to our tents. But sleep didn't come easily. I lay there, listening to the sounds of the forest, every rustle and whisper sending a fresh wave of anxiety through me. After what felt like hours, I drifted off, only to be jolted awake by a blood-curdling scream. I shot up, heart pounding, as the others scrambled out of their tents. The fire had died down to embers, casting long, flickering shadows across the clearing. Jake was gone. "What the hell was that?" Tom asked, his voice shaking. "I don't know," Sarah whispered, her eyes wide with fear. "Where's Jake?" We searched the clearing, calling his name, but there was no sign of him. The flashlight lay abandoned near the fire, its beam cutting through the darkness, but Jake was nowhere to be found. "We need to leave," Emily said, her voice barely a whisper. "Now." We didn't argue, grabbing only what we could carry. We stumbled through the dark, back toward the trail that had brought us here. But the woods had changed. The trail was gone, swallowed by the darkness, and no matter which way we turned, we couldn't find it. Panic set in as we wandered deeper into the forest, the trees closing in around us. That feeling of being watched was stronger now, almost suffocating. I could feel eyes on me, following us as we stumbled through the underbrush. And then, the whispers started again, louder this time, closer. I couldn't make out the words, but the tone was unmistakable, malicious, mocking. "We're going in circles," Tom said, his voice trembling. "We've passed that tree 3 times already. We can't just stop," I said. But the truth was, I didn't know where we were going. The forest was disorienting. Every tree looked the same, and the darkness seemed to press in on us from all sides. Suddenly, Emily screamed. I spun around, but she was gone. One moment she was there, right behind me, and the next she had vanished, swallowed by the shadows. "Emily!" Sarah called, her voice shaking. But there was no response, only the faint sound of footsteps retreating into the darkness. We ran, blindly, tripping over roots and rocks as the forest seemed to close in around us. I don't know how long we ran, but eventually, we collapsed in a small clearing, gasping for breath. "Where's everyone?" Sarah sobbed, clutching her knees to her chest. "Where did they go?" I didn't have an answer. I didn't know what was happening. All I knew was that something was out there, hunting us. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, the forest fell silent. The whispers stopped, the rustling ceased. There was nothing but the sound of our own ragged breathing. "We have to keep moving," I whispered, though I wasn't sure if I believed it myself. But before we could stand, a figure stepped out of the trees. It was Jake, or at least it looked like Jake. His clothes were torn, his face pale and gaunt, his eyes wide and unblinking. There was something wrong about him, something off. He moved stiffly, like a puppet on strings. "Jake!" I whispered, but he didn't respond. He just stood there, staring at us with those wide, empty eyes. And then, slowly, a smile spread across his face. A cold, twisted smile that sent a chill down my spine. "We should never have come here," he whispered, his voice barely audible. And then, before we could react, he turned and disappeared back into the trees, swallowed by the darkness. We never saw him again.